They left no written language, no founding myth, no name for themselves that survived in any readable form. What they left instead were stones. Enormous carved standing stones scattered across the highlands and islands of northern Scotland, covered in symbols that have been studied for over 2 centuries and have never been fully decoded. Spirals and crescents, double discs and broken arrows, abstract geometric patterns of breathtaking precision, carved into rock by people whose identity, whose language, whose very name came to us only through their enemies. The Romans called them Picti, the painted ones, a term that appears in Roman sources beginning in the late 3rd century CE, applied to the northern peoples who lived beyond Hadrian's Wall, beyond the reach of Roman civilization, in the cold highlands that the legions never successfully conquered. The name may have referred to tattooing or body paint. It may have been a generic term for northern barbarians. It tells us almost nothing about who these people actually were. And yet for over 200 years, the question of Pictish origins was considered, by most serious scholars, essentially settled. The Picts were Celts, pre-Roman Celtic inhabitants of Scotland, who had simply never been Romanized, never been assimilated into the wave of cultural and linguistic transformation that swept most of Britain during and after the Roman period. Their mysterious symbols were art, not writing. Their apparently non-Indo-European language, known only from a handful of Ogham inscriptions and place names, was probably a Celtic language so archaic or so dialectally distinct that it appeared anomalous. They were, the consensus held, simply Scots before Scotland existed. Then the ancient DNA was extracted from Pictish graves, and the comfortable consensus fractured in ways that no one had entirely anticipated. The archaeological record of the Picts has always been fragmentary. Because they left no written records, everything we know about them comes from outside accounts, most of them hostile, from the carved stones themselves, from a handful of burials, and from the place names that survive in modern Scottish geography as the only audible remnant of a language that has otherwise vanished entirely. The Picts dominated most of Scotland north of the Fourth Clyde Line for the better part of a millennium. They resisted the Romans so effectively that Hadrian built a wall to exclude them, and Antoninus built another wall further north, in a failed attempt to push the boundary. They fought off Viking raids. They merged politically with the Gaelic Scots in the 9th century, under the Kingdom of Alba, which became the foundation of modern Scotland. And then, with remarkable speed, they disappeared from the historical record. Not violently, not through conquest. They simply stopped being mentioned as a distinct people. Where did they go, and where did they come from in the first place? The first serious ancient DNA work on Pictish remains began appearing in the late 2010s. A landmark study published in 2023 in the journal PLOS Genetics, led by researchers from the University of Central Lancashire and several collaborating institutions, analyzed whole genome data from 5 individuals from confirmed Pictish-era burial sites in eastern Scotland, dating to the 4th through 7th centuries CE. The sample sizes were small, as ancient DNA work in the cool, damp climate of Scotland often is, but the genomic data was of sufficient quality to produce results that immediately complicated the dominant narrative. The first finding was, in broad terms, consistent with existing expectations. The Pictish individuals showed ancestry primarily derived from the same sources as other ancient British populations. The mixture of Neolithic farmer ancestry and Bronze Age steppe-related ancestry that characterizes most ancient inhabitants of the British Isles was present in the Pictish genomes in proportions similar to what had been found in Iron Age populations elsewhere in Britain. In this fundamental sense, the Picts looked genetically like Britons. They were not, as some older theories had proposed, a dramatically different population, with roots in a completely separate migration. But within that broad similarity, the details were striking. The Pictish individuals clustered, when compared against a comprehensive reference panel of ancient British populations, distinctly toward the northern and western edges of the genetic landscape of ancient Britain. They showed stronger affinities with populations from Iron Age Scotland and northern Britain than with populations from southern Britain or from the continent. More specifically, they showed a genetic continuity with populations that appear to have been present in Scotland before the major Bronze Age steppe expansions that transformed the genetic composition of southern Britain most dramatically, suggesting that northern Scotland had served as a partial refuge for older population structures in the same way that geographic peripheries often do. This was not the finding of a completely different people, but it was the finding of a population with a distinct trajectory, one that had experienced the same broad waves of ancient migration that shaped all of Britain while remaining more isolated, more continuous with what had come before, and genetically more distinct from their southern neighbors than the standard narrative of pan-Celtic British identity had suggested. The language question, which the genetics cannot directly resolve, becomes more interesting in light of this finding. If the Picts were genetically more continuous with pre-Celtic or early Celtic populations of northern Britain, this provides a plausible framework for understanding why their language appeared so anomalous to later observers. Not necessarily because it was a different language family entirely, but because it may have preserved features of an older linguistic stratum that had been replaced or heavily modified further south by the same processes that had produced the more familiar forms of Celtic that we recognize in Welsh, Irish, and Scottish Gaelic. The symbols remain undeciphered. The 2023 study brought ancient DNA to the question of Pictish origins, but could not illuminate what those carved stones were trying to communicate. They were not an alphabet in any recognized sense. They did not encode a language the way Ogham inscriptions did. They were something else, a symbolic system of unknown function, perhaps territorial, perhaps genealogical, perhaps religious, perhaps all of these things simultaneously, whose meaning the people who carved them took entirely with them when they merged with the Kingdom of Alba and ceased to be recorded as a distinct people. After the political merger of the Pictish kingdoms with the Gaelic Scots in the 9th century, the Pictish language disappears from the record within roughly 2 generations. Their symbols stop being carved. Their distinct cultural identity stops being referenced in chronicles and saints' lives. The speed of this disappearance is one of the great puzzles of early medieval Scottish history. Political absorption does not usually produce cultural extinction this fast. Several explanations have been proposed. The most compelling involve the deliberate adoption of Gaelic as a prestige language by the Pictish elite following the political union, a process in which the ruling class of a conquered or merged people adopts the language of the new political order and the rest of the population follows within a generation or two. This kind of rapid elite language shift is documented in other historical periods and produces exactly the kind of sudden silence in the record that characterizes the Pictish disappearance. The Picts did not forget their language because they were suppressed or killed. They may have chosen, or been incentivized, to stop using it in public contexts where it would be recorded. The genomic data offers a partial and sobering answer to the deeper question of what became of the people themselves. The 2023 study examined not only the Pictish-era individuals, but also compared their ancestry against later medieval Scottish populations from the same geographic regions. What they found was that the Pictish genetic signal does not disappear after the 9th century. It persists. The people did not die or flee. They remained in the same landscapes, farming the same ground, likely speaking Gaelic within a generation or two, but carrying in their genomes the deep continuity with northern British populations that the ancient DNA had detected in their Pictish-era ancestors. The Picts were not replaced. They were absorbed, their language went silent, their symbols stopped being carved, their names stopped being used, but their ancestry continued in the people who became medieval Scots, and persists today in the population of northern and eastern Scotland, in detectable, if now heavily diluted form. This is the Pictish paradox. A people so distinctive that Rome built walls to keep them out, so culturally coherent that they maintained a unique symbolic tradition for centuries, so politically organized that they resisted Viking invasion and Roman expansion alike, and yet so thoroughly absorbed into a successor identity that within living memory of their political eclipse they had ceased to be named. The modern genetic landscape of Scotland reflects this in ways that researchers are still mapping. Studies of contemporary Scottish populations show a detectable gradient in certain ancestry components between the north and east, where Pictish settlement was densest, and the west and south, where Gaelic and later Norse and Anglo-Norman influences are more pronounced. This is not a dramatic genetic division. Scotland is not, genetically, 2 countries. But there is a signal, faint but real, that corresponds to the ancient geographic distribution of a people history almost entirely forgot. The Picts were never entirely what we thought they were, because we thought about them mostly through the lens of what their enemies and successors chose to record. The Romans saw painted warriors beyond a useful boundary. The Gaelic Scots saw neighbors, rivals, and eventually subjects. Medieval chroniclers saw a people absorbed into a Christian kingdom with a new name. None of these perspectives had any particular incentive to preserve the complexity of Pictish identity, and so most of that complexity was lost. What remains are the stones, distributed across the Scottish landscape from Shetland to the Firth of Forth, carved with symbols that mean something specific to someone, and that will not reveal what that something is to us. They are the most visible signature of a people whose DNA has now been partially recovered, whose genetic continuity has been partially established, and whose language, art, and inner world remain, perhaps permanently, beyond our reach. There is something in this that reaches beyond the specific case of the Picts, the story of a people who left enormous physical monuments, who shaped the political and cultural landscape of a country for 1,000 years, and who then effectively vanished from historical memory within a century of political absorption, is not unique in human history. It is, in fact, the normal fate of peoples who do not leave written records that survive. The exceptionalism of literate civilizations in the historical record is not a reflection of their actual demographic weight or cultural significance in the ancient world. It is a reflection of the accident of textual survival. The DNA does not care about the accident of textual survival. It records what was there regardless of whether anyone wrote it down, regardless of whether the people who carried it were celebrated or dismissed or simply forgotten. In the genomes of people living today in Aberdeenshire and Angus and Caithness, there is a thread that runs back through the medieval Scots, to the people who carved the symbols on the stones, to an Iron Age population of northern Britain, whose political and cultural identity was erased, but whose biological presence was not. History, as the Picts demonstrate more clearly than almost any other case, is not only what was written, it is also what survived in bodies that left no documents, carried by people who had no idea they were preserving anything at all. The stones are waiting to be read. The genome has already begun to tell us what the stones cannot, and what it tells us is that the Picts were never simply a footnote to Scottish history. They were, and in some meaningful genetic sense still are, one of its oldest and most persistent chapters.